reason we're doing this and have reconvened here in British Columbia is that when we did the Alchemy of Nine conventions, we almost, I don't know why, skipped past the fourth dimension. And which, because it has such immediate and direct influence on this dimension, it seems like that was a huge oversight. And I thought, what happened? So now we're back, and now we have a chance to really go into it, and we're going to devote the hour to the fourth dimension and also the beings associated with its influence and control in terms of humanity, which are the Anunnaki. And so what I would like to do is have you first give us the standard understanding of who the Anunnaki are, Sitchin style. And then we're going to go on, and I'm going to get your impressions beyond Sitchin in some very direct questions. So first of all, set up the Anunnaki.
Well, the Anunnaki, are also called the Anunnaki, are the gods in Sumerian literature, and then they pass into Akkadian and Babylonian literature. And we've known about these gods since the Sumerian tablets were translated 200 years ago. And mostly Sumerian scholars have investigated this issue, and it's very similar to the pantheon in Egyptian teaching, or in any religious teaching, any ancient religious teaching. And then Zecharia Sitchin came along in 1976 and published The 12th Planet, which is his interpretation of who the Anunnaki are in the Sumerian scriptures. And I think he's partially right, but I don't think he's totally right. And so
set us up with how he described who they were, what their role is, why they were here.
Right. He says that they were a bunch of extraterrestrials, and he says that they come from a planet that he calls Nibiru, which means in Sumerian the planet of the crossing. And it just means Nibiru means the crossing. And so he says that this planet goes around the sun, and it's part of our solar system, and it goes around, it passes close to Earth every 3,600 years. And he says that when it passes close to Earth, that the Anunnaki then land, and he believes that he's not with us anymore, but he believed that they had spaceships. He believes that their literature discusses spaceships, and I don't really think so personally. But he believes that the Sumerian literature is describing the gods coming down from Nibiru and from the sky, and then once they get down to the Earth, then they take over human culture and impregnate the best looking women and produce a race. So that's Sitchin's basic story.
And I mean, from that, a lot of other people have picked up on that basic story. And what comes out of it is the notion that we're a slave species.
That's right.
To the gods.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
And tell us where the enslavement part of that story comes in.
Well, he believes that they have been coming to the Earth for the last 400,000 years. And first of all, I see no evidence for that in archaeology whatsoever, but there are people who would disagree with that. We first start seeing real evidence of human mining activity and all that, as far as I'm concerned, around 100,000 years ago with red ochre mining in southern Africa. So he believed that they have been enslaving the human race for 400 years, and then gradually...
400,000, yeah.
Excuse me, 400,000 years, right. And they're gradually triggering humans into evolving. And it just doesn't fit with my own paradigm at all with what has happened with the human race, not at all.
Okay, let's go into that story a little bit further, and then I want to get to the Pleiadians and speak about this. There's something in there that's a nuance that I've always wondered about. Okay, but so the primary characters were Enlil and Enki, right?
Yeah.
And what were their positions? Because they really were in opposing positions.
Well, they're kind of like, in the literature itself, they're kind of like a Cain and Abel type figure. And Enki is the good guy, and Enlil is the bad guy, the bad god. And to tell you the truth, I can't really say too much more about it. I haven't really studied that.
But do you think that maybe the Christian lore of Cain and Abel was directly handed down through that particular story?
Well, yeah, what happened with the Sumerian literature, we know for sure, is that as far as Western religion is concerned, The stories that are in the Sumerian literature, and then the Akkadian literature, and then the Babylonian literature, we know that those influence the Bible, because a lot of the stories in the Bible go back to the earlier literature. You know, so you could say Cain and Abel could be a model of Enlil and Enki.
Right.
You could say that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now, what about the Nibiru? The whole notion of this planet. I mean, there are chat rooms around the world that are hysterical about our
Millions.
annihilation by the planet Nibiru. Let's talk about it from your perspective.
Yes, I'll do that from two perspectives. First of all, there are many points of view we can take regarding what's actually going on with the solar system and whether this planet exists or not. There's also a lot of people who believe that we're actually a binary star system.
Right.
And that's what I think. And the major person on that score is a guy named Cruttenden.
Walter
scientist
Cruttenden,
Walter
yes.
Cruttenden. And so there is an issue with something influencing the sun and something influencing the solar system. But having studied both ideas, I find that the issue of the binary star system a lot more. I see, Regina, I go more towards science.
Right.
You know, and so with the binary star system, since we now know that at least 95% of the suns out in the universe are binary, there's every reason to think that our sun is binary.
And Cruttenden says in his belief that companion star is Sirius.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you? I mean, certainly with the emphasis on Sirius and the times of the Egyptians.
But then there's an issue. A lot of people think that we can't see it, and I think even Cruttenden gets into issues of how we can't see it, because when something's
Brown dwarf.
when something's going around like that, it's hard to detect it and hard to see it. And so I would tend to think that we're just not seeing it because it's a brown dwarf. I tend to go in that direction, but we don't really know. And again, this is one of these. We're in a period of a marvelous time of discovery.
Well, and there are dynamics that are in play all the time regarding essentially keeping the cosmos in its place.
That's right.
And there are forces of repulsion and attraction that are always in place that keep these systems stable and safe. Yet, we buy so terribly into this notion that something's going to come and slam into us again, create another cataclysm, and it's that planet. And so his work has instilled a great deal of fear in people.
Well, see, I think that you're getting closer to why people have bought into the Sitchin idea to this degree. Because what I look for when I watch an idea like this and playing out and seeing how people respond is when I see a tremendous amount of fear and a tremendous amount of what's the right word for it? Just apocalyptical thoughts. I get pretty suspicious because people just tend to buy into apocalyptical thoughts, and so I think that this cataclysm that we actually did experience, scientifically, we know about all of these cataclysms from 11,500 to 13,000 years ago. We have all the data on it now. And I think what we're seeing with people is a tendency to buy into an apocalypse now because it happened before.
Right.
I think, and then one of the interesting things to me about my lifetime is that my grandfather was half Cherokee, and he was my teacher, and he taught me all about the cataclysm and all about the stuff that I've come through with in this lifetime in my work. And what was strange for me as a child was there was my grandfather's story, and he was a Cherokee record keeper, and so he knew what he was talking about. And then, meanwhile, science completely contradicted his story until Velikovsky started publishing books in the 1960s and 1970s.
Right.
And so it was a mystery to me when I was growing through my levels of education as to why people didn't get the real story, because to me it was kind of obvious what the real story was, but of course I was told the real story. And then finally I have come to the conclusion that the part of the post-traumatic stress syndrome is the ability to just block the memory, because the memory is so terrifying of what happened, because it was really bad. I mean, very little survived on this planet. It's a miracle that our species is even here.
And virtually every major religion reflects this story.
That's right.
Right.
And so then what happens is that people, because they've been denied the story by science, and I watched scientists through the 70s and 80s, they tried to shut Velikovsky down, they tried to get his publisher to stop publishing him. He was really, like a lot of people who have really correct ideas, was really harassed by the scientific establishment. And so I finally decided that scientists have a great big case of primary catastrophophobia.
Yes.
In other words, they are so terrified that anything like this could have happened that they continually deny it. But fortunately, we are now in a time where everybody knows this happened. First of all, in alternative research, the big alternative researchers work with this concept, like Graham Hancock
and Robert Schoch and
Ball. And so we've come to a point now where people know about this, and then the scientific establishment, meanwhile, is digging up all the data.
Right.
So new paradigm is in place, and it's going to straighten out a lot of confused thinking.
But a lot of this confusion actually came at the hands of Sitchin originally, and so many devotees of his work have really gone on to expand on his story.
Yeah,
but if it was distorted thinking to begin with, what we're getting is something more distorted, essentially. And you knew him when? I would like to, if you don't really talk about this much, but I would like you to share a little bit about your early meeting with and relationship with him.
I don't share it very much because my primary career in this lifetime has been as a publisher.
Right.
And so I rarely talk about people that I published and authors that I worked with and all that. And because our company was one of the publishers of Sitchin's work, the hardcover editions, I'm really not at liberty to say a lot of things because it's a professional issue. But of course I got to know him because I get to know all of our authors, and I had some very interesting conversations with them. And I have a lot of respect for him. And you know William Irwin Thompson, the philosopher? You remember William Irwin Thompson? Well, William Irwin Thompson, I think he's probably dead now because he was 10 or 15 years older than I am. But William Irwin Thompson and I got into a 6-hour conversation about this about 20 years ago. And William finally said, you know what, Barbara, this is a case of misplaced concreteness. And I really
explain what that means to us.
really like that idea because what he was saying, and it's true, that a lot of what Sitchin had to say was true. But then he had to go too far with it because you don't have to. It's just like the whole issue of extraterrestrials abducting people and some of the issues that we saw happening 20 years ago so frequently. In my experience, people turn psychic things into solid things. So it doesn't have to, the Anunnaki do not have to be solid beings that landed with spaceships on this planet, but they still could exist as beings in the universe.
And that's what we'll talk about, is reaching in from another realm, from another dimensional field.
Yeah.
But still, it ended up that there seemed to be an agenda that was playing out in Sitchin's work. And maybe explain what that agenda was, from your point of view.
It's worth really getting into the agenda, but I'd just like to say before that my part in it is that in the Alchemy of 9 Dimensions, the Pleiadians, not me, but the Pleiadians came through and said that every dimension has a keeper.
Yes.
And there's 9 dimensions.
Right.
So like there's Sirius keeps the 6th dimension, the Pleiades the 5th dimension. So what they seem to be saying is that in each one of these dimensions there are intelligences, but they aren't necessarily solid human beings like we are. We're the keepers of the 3rd dimension. And so we're solid human beings sitting here right now.
Right.
And so what they said was the Anunnaki are the keepers of the 4th dimension. And I've spent the last 25 years working on that and trying to understand it. And I feel that I do understand it now, that in the sense that they are the holders of a gigantic psychological archetypal realm.
Right.
And in that sense, we humans seem to need to have an archetypal field to play in between dark and light. Like I think when that kind of experience is healthy, it shows up in art and various forms of art and mystery play and dancing and music and all that. And then I think when that field becomes unhealthy, it goes into politics and bad guys and good guys and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So the Anunnaki, these gods or beings of this dimension, are the keepers and holders of all of that information and all that data.
And so what is it in the direction, he was supposedly directly translated from cuneiform, right? This knowledge.
Yeah.
What was it in there, embedded in there, that made him believe these were physical beings?
as far as I'm concerned, it's his own belief. Now, there's another issue with Zecharia Sitchin's translations. He when he published his books, a lot of Sumerian experts were really freaked out because they've studied the literature, and so have I. The Enuma Elish is one of my favorite spiritual works. And they freaked out because they just didn't see it the same way. So finally, one Sumerian scholar, a big-time Sumerian scholar, went after Sitchin's translations. And just like with all translations, they have a real slant to them. And so the slant is to go into this description of these gods who landed in spaceships and stuff like that.
So in the minds of the other scholars, these were not physical entities.
Yes, exactly. Before Sitchin came along, they didn't. They just think of them as like the Egyptian pantheon.
Right.
People don't think of Anubis and Ra as physical beings who
Right.
came down and landed.
Right.
Although there are issues with that one too, because some people do think that.
Right.
And some people think that around 6,000 years ago or something like that, the beings of Sirius, the Egyptian pantheon, actually landed on the Earth. So it's really a sticky wicket as far as I'm concerned. For instance, you have to wonder, like, are we talking about beings who become solid here but otherwise aren't solid where they exist?
Exactly.
Like, that's my experience with the Pleiades.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you
Yeah.
next.
Yeah, the only place I have any direct experience is with the Pleiadians.
Right.
And I basically am almost like a hybrid person, an Earth human being, and a person who lives on the Pleiades. And when I'm existing in the Pleiades, which is often meditation and very high states of consciousness, I'm not particularly physical. I'm almost more like an electromagnetic light form, and then I've seen them twice. I saw them when I was 4 months old, and I still remember it, and then I saw them when I was around 40. So the most significant appearance is when I was an adult, and I had 4 children, and the 2 younger ones were like 3 and 5 years old. So when you're home with small children, you can't take your eyes off of them. So in this case, I had a house and I had a kitchen and I had a study behind. And the Pleiadians, I was in my study. For some reason, I got a few minutes or whatever, and maybe Jerry was outside, I don't know. But they appeared in my study. And it was a group of them, like around 13 or 14 of them, who just parked themselves on a banco. That's what they call beds in New Mexico. They stayed there for 4 hours. I went back into the house, checked everything, came back and forth 4 or 5 times, and they were just there, and they were radiating the most exquisite, beautiful energy, just an energy of just absolute unconditional love.
What did they look like to you?
Like I say, they're like Casper the Ghost. Like I had 13 or 14 little Casper the Ghosts in the banco bed. And they were almost palpable.
It's interesting because once you start getting into this, then you start looking at the stories of other people. Stephen Greer, for one, he closely aligns himself with the Pleiades as well, and those beings. And for him, when you see his drawings, they're very humanoid in nature. Now, and I even remember him saying to a group of people who were saying, well, what do they look like? And he pointed to me. He said, they look like her, right? So now where would he get an impression that Pleiadians look more or less like me or us?
Well, this is an interesting question because there's a whole bunch of Pleiadians. Because remember, there's 7 stars in the system.
Right.
And as far as I can tell, in different stars and different planets, they have different appearances as far as I can tell.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the ones I'm relating to are these little electromagnetic beings. But I agree with what he says about you because I've also seen a blonde-type Pleiadian.
Yes,
Yeah,
okay.
I've seen the type.
Okay, and another thing that I found kind of curious about this is the Pleiades can be seen with the naked eye. And so we're looking at something that's roughly in our range of frequency, which would be still more or less considered third dimensional. So if the planets exist physically in the third dimension, are we seeing beings that are another expression or living within another dimension of those planets, just as Earth is multidimensional and we are?
Well, as you know, in my system, the Pleiades is 5th dimensional.
Right.
And then the Earthing is we're third dimensional linear space and time.
That's why I'm asking that.
Right. So as far as I can tell, they exist in a fifth dimensional realm.
But in the general region of those third dimensional planets, or what appear to be third dimensional.
They may not be. And like, for example, take the Syrians, and some people think that they see beings that look like the Syrians.
Right.
But boy, what I see is just outrageous complex geometry.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what are we seeing when we see the light from those stars at night in the sky?
We're seeing the same thing we're seeing with any kind of starlight.
Right.
But I do think that the planets and star systems that are keepers of the dimensions, I think we have very profound reactions to them. I think people have strong reaction to Sirius, and certainly to the Pleiades. People
Yes.
talk about that. And then also the Orion star system, which is the keeper of the eighth dimension. That star system has had a huge impact on humanity and sacred geometry on this planet, because all over the planet we have renditions of the Orion star system all over the planet at sacred sites.
Right.
So people, for some reason, are mirroring the eighth dimension down here.
Yes. Okay, so now let's go back to the Anunnaki. Thank you for clarifying that with the Pleiadians.
But I'd like to say one more
Yes,
thing,
please.
Regina, just to clarify it as much as we can.
Yeah.
John Mack did a lot of really wonderful
did.
work at Harvard, showing that what people see is directly relational to where their consciousness is at.
Yes.
So, like, let's say a being appears in my space or your space from the eighth dimension, which is the realm of divine consciousness. You can call it God, goddess if you want to. One person might see Jesus, another person might see Mary Magdalene, another person might see an electromagnetic form, another
Right.
person might see a bird. In other words, like what people see, you're looking at something that is not physical in the way we are in this dimension. It's a different thing.
Right.
And so people perceive it differently.
Yes.
You know,
That is very true. And
Yeah.
John Mack's work was stunning in that. And what did you take away from John Mack's work? And that, essentially he said this phenomena, there are commonalities to this abduction phenomena, right? He had, thousands of clinical cases
Yeah.
in the end. And put his own reputation on the line for it and said, whatever's going on, there are consistent themes that are happening in these
Yes.
cases.
Yes.
What do you think what do you attribute that to?
well, see, if you look at things from the point of view of the archetypal mind, archetypal consciousness, it seems to have been a phase, by the way. You notice how you don't hear about
Yes.
it anymore? It seems to have just been a period of time.
Right.
And it could be that we were getting to the point in the 1940s, 1950s or whatever. First of all, let's look at the fact that science was exploring space. And so once science started going out into space and exploring it, then people naturally started thinking about, well, how am I connected to that? And what kind of encounter am I going to have? And so then if a person is going through some kind of a traumatic experience, like some kind of nightmarish experience, they may see it as extraterrestrials. If we look at people historically, they've seen these things as gnomes, as angels, as extraterrestrials. So where is that coming? The question is, where is that coming from?
Right.
Well, if you really understand my nine-dimensional model, my nine-dimensional model is saying that in this dimension, in the third dimension, impulses are coming through to us from higher realms. And then what happens is they filter through the fourth dimension. That's
Right.
the way the system basically works. So let's just assume this is true. And let's assume that for some reason, which I don't think we completely understand, let's say that impulses are coming at us from higher dimensions.
Right.
And we know one thing about that, because I'm sure you've had a few what I call numinous experiences, where you just have an experience of something that is so otherworldly that
Yes.
it just you
Yes.
just are stunned.
Right.
And so then, okay, there you are. Maybe you're a 4-year-old child. Maybe you're a teenager or whatever. What do you do with that? Well, the human mind naturally goes through its own program to seek a way to explain what that is, to see what that is, Then I'll add and so that's kind of, other people have said there's nothing unusual about that, but I'll say something that most people haven't been willing to say. When I was grappling with this issue of, like, why are all these people getting abducted and hauled away in cars and all that, you remember that. It was,
Yes.
the 80s and 90s mostly.
Yes.
So, of course, like with anything, I went into a deep level of questioning about this. Like, what could possibly this be? The abductions especially. And then I realized, you know what? There's nothing in these stories by these extraterrestrials abducting humans that isn't going on in medical technology day after day
That
after
is
day. And then suddenly I realized that these bizarre stories of people being abducted and all these things done to them corresponded exactly with the point when people started buying into and paying their money for invasive medical technology. So I think a lot of it has been a way of processing modern medicine, because I think modern medicine is an extremely traumatic situation.
It is, yet
Yeah.
you probably would not have a direct lineup with the individuals that Sitchin was dealing with, all of them having had invasive medical procedures. Are you saying it was more in the
No, I'm saying it's a
cumulative
way
mind?
of, so just think, okay, go back to 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever, when the really invasive type tech, and when I say invasive type technology, people are supposed to go off and get tested regularly to see if there's anything wrong with them or not,
Right.
instead of just living
Right.
and knowing they're okay
Very
until
true.
it's time to go to the doctor. So suddenly people got under the microscope around 40 or 50 years ago, and my father was a doctor and a very big doctor in the AMA, and he was American Medical Association, and he was very, very upset by what was going on, because suddenly we turned the human into something that had to be examined, prodded, I mean, like colonoscopies.
And profited from.
Things like that. Like, well, that's what the zeta reticuli do, if you know what I mean. So what I'm trying to say is back to the fourth dimension, which is our topic today,
Yes.
which is the archetypal realm of consciousness, and the part of our awareness that splits energy into dark and light. As this invasive medical technology started to come into people's lives, and then they're gored into paying for it and suffering for it, etc., I think that the invasive extraterrestrial issue might have actually been a way for people to process
that.
medicine.
Interesting.
And I because now it's all gone.
Right.
Where did that go?
Right.
You know, and then a whole bunch of people just don't go to the doctor anymore, you know, now.
Well, it seems when it comes to the ET story, you
Yeah.
have waves of types of characters and stories that emerge decade by decade.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that era was the era of abduction, for example.
Yeah.
You know, and now we're kind of moving on almost to transhumanism.
Yeah.
Right?
So
Take a
what-
little alien DNA.
Yeah, so if you take if you take space technology and combine it with medical technology, they do correspond at the same time.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point.
And
Okay,
when
let's-
something happens in our reality, this is a really important point. When some kind of big change, an unusual thing occurs in our reality, everybody processes it. You know, it doesn't just happen in the hospital down the street. We all process what's coming into our reality. Like right now, I think we're all trying to process what's going on with computer devices and what's going on with some of the, well, for example, how about robots? How are we going to process robots? You know, but I think we need to start realizing in that reality, okay, the fourth dimension, we are all very, very, very heavily impacted by the fourth dimension every day. And I've used the analogy that we're like an Oreo cookie.
Right.
And the second dimension is the bottom of the cookie with the dark cake or whatever it's made out of. That's the realm under us where the earthquakes come from. And then we're the sticky, gooey sugar in the third dimension. And then the fourth dimension is the top of the Oreo cookie. And so lo and behold, I found out from another researcher, Scott Wolter, last week when I was reading a book, that the Oreo cookie is, and I showed it to you.
You did, you brought a
when
package
Regina
of them
arrived
here.
this time, I gave her an Oreo cookie because the Oreo cookies are all imprinted with all of the main Templar symbols.
That's right. I was shocked when you
You know,
pointed that out.
and when you
If
think
someone
of
starts
trillions
looking
and
at it, the
trillions of
Maltese
people.
cross, the fleur-de-lis.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, looking at that on a subliminal level. But essentially what you're saying then is, the fourth dimension is influencing our feelings and our thoughts into this
Yeah.
field, and that we are more collectively connected by mind than we give ourselves credit for.
That's right. I think because I think the trick with the fourth dimension, and after all of this struggle with things, including Zecharia Sitchin's work, I've kind of gotten to the point where I feel like I really understand it. And so the facts are, as far as I'm concerned, like an Oreo cookie, we're sandwiched between the second and the fourth dimension. Here we are, right in between here. And then we're having to deal with earthquakes and volcanoes and earth movements and all the second dimensional forces coming up. And then the fourth dimensional forces are just as palpable for us, but they're emotionally palpable. And then if you think about it, what's the most difficult part of anybody's life? Emotions.
Emotions.
Yeah, right. So the fourth dimension is the reason I think we didn't do much with it before is it's such a difficult dimension to deal with.
So our emotions are being influenced and even manipulated from the fourth?
That's where it gets interesting. That's
Right.
where it's up to us. All right. So regarding the fourth dimension, what goes on, as far as I can tell, is these 5 other dimensions, higher dimensions, are continually penetrating the fourth dimension. Because in order to get to us in 3D, you got to go through the fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension is polarized into dark and light. And so once we start getting impulsed by it, it comes to us by means of our feelings. And so what we need to do is we need to become really accurate readers of our own feelings. We need to start, and it's just like anything, it's just like any other learning curve in life. If you really concentrate on what you're feeling, and if you're not drugged out and getting drunk all the time or whatever you're doing, and if you really attune to your feelings and really pick up on your feelings, then the higher energies start to come through: inspiration, art, creativity. But if you're deadening your consciousness to your feelings, if you're constantly like putting it down through addictions or addictive behavior or whatever, then you're stuffing your feelings, and it won't work.
But the thing is, when you start the book, you talk about this chapter on fourth dimension. You say, how do you know your feelings are your own? Mm-hmm. If we are this connected in terms of our collective mind, mm-hmm. how do you begin separating your feelings out from something that's influencing you and part of the collective?
That's what's called learning how to operate with the fourth dimension. In other words, the fourth dimension is like a gigantic navigational zone. And if you really work with it and you really observe yourself and observe what's going on, you can tell whether something is your own feeling or somebody else's. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, we are being influenced all the time by the feelings of others. And then the media is constantly manipulating us through those feelings.
So there's something higher, deeper, truer in ourselves that would essentially be our yardstick for whether or not a feeling is our own.
And most importantly, this is our dimension right here.
Right.
We're sovereign in this dimension. And we get to choose what we're going to do. Like if you have a feeling about something, you don't have to do it. Mm-hmm. It's your choice as to whether you do it or not.
Right.
And so the feelings are constantly impacting us. But if we start to recognize that we are sovereign in our dimension, but it takes a tremendous amount of personal growth and personal commitment, doesn't it?
Yes, and the story, such as the slave species that we supposedly are, mm-hmm. really diminishes our ability to have that kind of sovereignty over ourselves.
Yeah.
And
so
it makes
let's
us
talk
highly
about
exploitable.
where have the Anunnaki gone?
Right.
You know, as far as I'm concerned, they're in the media, they're in the medical programs, they're in the Anunnaki, the God. Let's call it the God program instead of the Anunnaki, because it's the same program in any culture. It isn't just Sumerian. And what's happened is these belief systems have penetrated the systems that we use,
right.
And that's where we have to start distinguishing a little. What are we buying into? Mm-hmm. You know. I mean, one of the most profitable industries in the world ever is the cancer industry.
Oh boy!
So what are we buying into?
Exactly. Well, this might be slightly off topic, but let me ask you, what in the world of science, more quantum physics, Michio Kaku and the guys, right? Mm-hmm. How do they describe the attributes, or do they even try to describe attributes of the fourth dimension? Mm-hmm. Or is it just simply a frequency range that they've mm-hmm. identified with no attributes?
Well, as you know, Einstein's definition, scientific definition of the fourth dimension is different. So the system I'm working with is just a different system.
Right.
Yeah. And so as far as scientists are concerned and extremely rational people, one of the attributes of this period of time where we're mutating mm-hmm. out of this super rational phase of human consciousness is that people like scientists and very logical people basically have a strong tendency to try to completely ignore fourth dimensional impulses. Mm-hmm. You know, they for example, what would be a good example? When you're like trying to understand how the fourth dimension functions, dark and light, mm-hmm. the best way to start to figure out how it works is by means of the dark and light. And yet if you're an extremely rational scientific person, you just deny that any of that's real. It's not real, mm-hmm. you know, but it is real. And they are being impacted, extremely rational type people are being impacted constantly by these impulses as much as anybody else. But what they do is they have a logical mechanism in their brain that denies that things are real. So right now we're living with this complex scientific basic control of the planet mm-hmm. where certain things are simply not real, even though they are real mm-hmm. and they're real for lots and lots of people.
Right.
But the people who are at the top of the pyramid in control are in a position to declare what's real or not.
Right.
A lot.
Yet, am I mistaken in that later in the chapter on the fourth dimension in your book, The Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, you talk about how the beings in the fourth dimension, or you can call them elite or beings that manipulate from that dimension, actually do not like the process of logic and being rational. That doesn't work well for them because they can't manipulate. So is there some hidden benefit to not allowing themselves to
Yeah, there could
experience
be. Well,
it?
okay, look who's got all the power and the money at this point, the most rational people.
Right.
So it's just a phase right now. That's all. We're just in a phase of that, which is making it very, very hard for the people who aren't that rational, for the people who are a lot more artistic and intuitive. It's a pretty hard time. But let's watch closely to see what goes on with science. What happens is because there's such profound denial of other levels of reality, science can tend to go mad and can tend to go evil. Because if you deny the things that are actually real and are actually happening, eventually you could go pretty crazy.
Yeah. Okay, that makes total sense.
There's a lot of mad scientists, they really are. They're living in a world that doesn't have much to do with anything that's going to do anybody any good.
Well, it's like, look to the transhumanist movement, as far as I'm concerned, that's one expression of it. But also in the fourth dimension, it's credited with being the home of the Akashic records. So talk about that a little bit.
Actually, I meant to talk to you about that. The Akashic records are actually contained in the first dimension. That's where they're stored. But in the fourth dimension, because everybody's relating to everybody else, and because everybody's lifetime is intermeshed with everybody else's lifetime, then that information,
that's where they're accessed.
It's in the fourth dimension, yeah.
Okay, and then another expression of it tends to be kind of angelic realms. Guides and so forth. Talk about those attributes of the fourth dimension and how it interfaces with us.
Now, it's a very interesting point because in my system, the fourth dimension is an even number 4, and then the sixth dimension is in the eighth dimension. And so in my system, the higher guides are actually coming from the sixth dimension and the eighth dimension. And then, just like anything else, in order to get to us and to communicate with us and connect with us, they have to go through the fourth dimension. So what happens is beings that are actually of very high consciousness often will come through and be described as religious figures. In other words, we pick up on something that we think is God, but what we're missing is the really high frequency and high fine dimensionality of really divine consciousness.
And do they have to essentially lower their frequencies and their presences to be able to communicate with us then? And it can be seen as anything?
They don't. What happens is you or I, we're running the frequency of the fourth dimension. So if your consciousness is really high, then when a divine being wants to contact you, it just moves right through you and right through the fourth dimension and right into the third dimension. And if you got a really divine inspiration, you wouldn't tend to interpret it as Yahweh.
No.
Jehovah, right?
Right, no.
Okay, but millions of people on the planet, if they get any kind of impulse of higher energy, they would think that it's Jehovah.
Right.
You see how that works?
Yes, because that's the conditioning.
Yeah.
And you actually said in the book that there are beings such as Yahweh and Zeus that may actually have been somehow a fabrication of our collective mind. Can you talk about that? Because that's, then now we're getting into classic mythology and the beings in that realm.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating period. And that actually, in terms of Gebser's work, that goes back to the issue of the mythical point. So as soon as the mythical phase came in, then for couple thousand years, we saw these different beings in these different higher dimensions, and really we personified them basically. And so the Greek pantheon is especially fun, with the gods fighting with each other and taking their girlfriends and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at the stories of the gods in Greek mythology, they mirror the stories of human behavior, but it's a way for people to play with those archetypes. And so in a healthy culture, and one of my favorite healthy cultures is the Minoan culture, only because it's a fairly recent culture. Minoan culture back in 1500 BC. And the whole culture was dedicated to art. It was dedicated to mystery plays and making art and painting and all that, because if you're playing with these archetypes, they're a lot of fun. You could have a lot of fun with them.
Right.
But if they're denied, they start to become demonized.
Well, I was going to say, then where does the demonic realm come from? Same place?
That's a good question. I think it comes from the lower dimensions, from the second dimension. And I think for a certain number of people, and I'm playing with this in fiction. It's a really great thing to play with in fiction. For a certain number of people, when the forces come from the second dimension, they can have experiences, demonic type experiences. And that's a very, very complex topic.
Yes, it is.
As you know.
Yes.
But what can happen is that people can literally have demonic type experiences. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's talk about the Egyptians and how some of the beings showed up at that period of time, and the presence of these animal representations of the gods.
Yeah, I think the reason that the Egyptian consciousness and pantheon is so valuable to us is that it goes back to more like 1500 BC to about 4000 BC. It goes back further even than Sumerian culture, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, I mean, the Hermetics would say that the Egyptian culture extends back a couple 100,000 years. Yeah.
But the way I would put it is because things are so well preserved in Egypt, because the climate's so dry, and because it's such an ancient, Egyptian civilization appears to have been a relatively cohesive, peaceful civilization for 2,000 or 3,000 years, which is way beyond anybody else on the planet. So because it goes back to that earlier period, it's a much more pure and spiritual rendition of spiritual cultures, just because of its age. It goes back actually to the age of Taurus.
Well, and there's some proof there also in the fact that it was peaceful for those years.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and so the Egyptian culture seems to have had a good hierarchy with people, with workers and artists and pharaohs and all that. They seem to have been a fairly egalitarian culture. I know a lot of people don't think that's true, but when I look into it, as far as I can see, it's true. And then they had a fascinating pantheon that was related to animal archetypes. And where this comes from is, this is something that not a lot of people know about, but I think it's utterly fascinating. The Egyptians had a gigantic zoo on the Nile that could have been 300 to 500 years, 300 to 500 miles long on the Nile. This goes back to like 3000 BC. And they kept all the animals there, the hippopotamus and the eagles and everything that they had. And what they did was Egyptian priests spent their whole life studying a particular animal. And they would study the intelligence of that animal, because each animal has a different type of intelligence. And the Egyptians felt that if human beings were going to have a really high, multifaceted, complex consciousness, they needed to have the intelligence of the animals. So priests would actually meditate with the animals and teach about different animals, like Anubis or like Sati or something like that. And they would like teach people how to have the intelligence of that animal. And then we see that in indigenous culture, like in North America and First Nations, where people have animal clans and people identify, like with the turtle clan or the eagle clan or whatever. They're identifying with the intelligence of that animal. And so what this is telling us is that part of being human is having these different facets of animal consciousness.
And yet those became known as deities themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
These representations.
Because they were considered to be deities. Why? Because they were intelligent. And so they understood. I mean, when you start to think about what it takes, for example, for swans to migrate, from the North Pole all the way down to South America, and you start to really study what goes on with animals, you start to realize just the extreme intelligence of these beings.
Right.
And so in sacred cultures, versus just rational cultures, you see much more respect. And then what does that create? People are less likely to destroy species.
Right.
So one of the reasons we're having such a terrible problem with species being destroyed is people don't realize they're destroying their own minds.
Yes.
They're destroying their own habitat and their own intelligence.
Yes. Very good points. You're going back just for a moment, too, to the egalitarian nature of those dynasties in Egypt, the ones that we're more aware of. There's certain archaeological evidence that the people were not treated as slaves at that time. The workers on the great edifices and such had adequate housing, protein, and so forth, and this was a job like any other at any other point in history. Yeah. So it wasn't based on slavery.
Yeah. yeah.
So I don't know if that's your take on it or.
Well, I think that one of the things in the historical record that has really screwed a lot of stuff up is the Hebrew bad rap on the Egyptians.
Yes,
and the
that's
whole
what I'm
bad
saying.
rap coming from the Exodus. And then what was lost was through this negative attitude toward the Egyptians was the awareness that the Egyptians were really an egalitarian culture. And when the Hebrews started to come into Egypt, maybe 2000 BC, something like that, they weren't nearly as developed as the Egyptians at all. And so what happened is they didn't really recognize the beauty of what they were experiencing, because it was a very beautiful culture.
Right.
So there's another issue with animals too, Regina, that's interesting, is we now have the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, which is the site in Turkey, which has been carbon dated to 9400 BC, right after the Cataclysm, by the way, comes in. And Göbekli Tepe has all these pillars on it with all these animals, these raised relief animals on it. And so we can see that even 12,000 years ago in temples, people were honoring the animals and working with the animals. And then what we know from Göbekli Tepe, because of Andrew Collins, we know that what was going on at Göbekli Tepe was the animal images on the pillars are actually related to the animals of the zodiac. Yes. And so we start to realize that this animal consciousness is not only on the earth, but it's also in the sky. In other words, you could go back into this early consciousness, and we see this profound honoring of nature and the animals, which is what we just have to get back to.
Exactly. Just quickly, as an aside, Andrew, yourself, which culture did he believe Göbekli Tepe was a remnant of?
Yeah. He thinks that it's a remnant of the Aurignacian culture that I mentioned earlier, and so do I. So do I. Yeah, I think that the Aurignacian people were seafarers. They were sailing all over the place, from Europe over to America, all that stuff. And they seem to have done, in fact, they may be late remnants of the Atlanteans, of course, because you never know once you go back before the Cataclysm.
Right.
Are we talking about Atlanteans, or are we talking about Aurignacians?
Right.
But we do have a pretty good archaeological record on those guys. You know, and it would appear that they probably, but it was built right after the Cataclysm,
right?
And that's what's important. Obviously, as some attempt to save knowledge that they still had, and it became a record of the knowledge 11,500 years ago. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to interview Andrew on that sometime. Hard to get to.
Yeah.
Maybe you can arrange that.
Well, I wrote an article about that because my issue with Göbekli Tepe is I think the pillars are also showing postures.
Yes.
And so, in other words, I think that when we come back after the Cataclysm and we get beyond survivalism, one of the first things we see is the sacred postures.
Yes. The reemergence of those sacred postures.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we'll continue. We can do another talk on that, because that was something I do want to talk to you about, but now we'll continue on the 4D subject. And one of the things you mentioned, you just tapped on earlier, is that 4D exists as a duality, not a duality.
Yeah.
Black and white, playing off of each other.
Right. That's right.
And let's talk about that. What happens to us as humans when we choose to play on or off one side or the other, or align with just one of the sides in a duality?
Yeah. Well, the goal with the duality issue is to have it be a polarity. So let's say you have an issue between maybe a good example. Usually it's an emotional dynamic of some kind, but maybe you have like a severe father complex and a severe father issue. And so in the early stages, and when you're trying to resolve it, in your mind you go, he's either this or he's either that. And then as you start to develop more and you start to grow more, you start to realize, well, no, he's not this or that, he's both. And then as you develop an issue more, it becomes a polarity where you can see the whole range of what an issue is. Because just think of the complexity of, for instance, the relationship of a daughter and a father. And so all of us have various complexes because we are attempting to grow more in that area. And if we just say something is black or white, he's good or he's bad, you're not going to get very far with it.
And you're saying that actually limits the access to our own higher consciousness at this point.
Yeah, the fourth dimension is meant to be a real polarity, and the keepers of the fourth dimension are there to create the space for people to examine all elements of a dynamic. Now, then of course, I immediately went, when I understood that to some extent, was, well, why does it work that way? Well, if you think about it, we're all electromagnetic. And we know from physics, for example, that the particles split. And things like that. And so it's just the very nature of reality to have things split into dualities. But our job as humans in the third dimension is to bring that all together into a complex
create a state
polarity.
of coherence again.
Yeah, because the real richness actually comes from those areas of the dark and the light. So one of the countries that I really enjoy teaching in is Bali, because Bali continues to have constant mystery plays of the dark and light. And the dark gods and the light gods and all, and they play with it.
Do they reconcile it? Or
Pardon?
do they find a way to reconcile it?
Oh,
in
yeah.
this?
The mystery plays always resolve it, where
Yes.
somebody learns something, or a being learns something.
Yet at the same time, when people start receiving these impulses from the fourth dimension, they oftentimes, as you say in your book, ignore them. And why is it we're so resistant to these messages, which seems to be where we are right now as a species? There are exceptions, of course, that are growing out of this, but really stuck and resistant.
Yeah. Well, if you start examining your feelings, you have to grow. So if you can just stuff your feeling, you don't have to grow. So there's always a strong tendency for people not to grow. And then what happens is the feeling gets stronger and stronger, and finally you can't deny it. And then usually with feelings, what happens is it shows up in a partner. We attract a partner to us who's going to play out
This
the whole
drama.
range of feeling drama
The
that we're trying
duality.
to deny. That's right. And so this whole emotional realm that we live in is this complex emotional dynamic. And there is definitely a strong tendency to try to avoid it. And we're coming out of the Victorian era where they were experts at denying feelings. And so we've been,
yes.
our generation and the generation after us is breaking this tendency down, because once people allowed themselves to become rigid and deny their feelings, then life became very boring.
Right.
You look at the typical picture of a Victorian parlor
Yes.
in 1890, just filled
Right.
with junk.
Yeah.
You know, because people they don't feel anything, but they have all this stuff around them.
Right.
And so we've been growing beyond that. And also, in my lifetime, by discovering that we're a multi-traumatized species from the cataclysms, then we also have been blasting through feelings of fear and feelings of denial.
Because of this vulnerability that is in the collective mind, the beings that reach through, you have beings reaching through from the fourth dimension that are maybe of a lower nature and also of a higher nature. Those of a higher nature are whispering to us to help inspire us to open our minds. Right?
But usually those inspirations are actually coming from the
From
higher
those other
five dimensions.
right.
Yeah, and they'll come through into the fourth dimension to work with it. But usually they're actually those, and so the point would be that the more you do work with the feelings and the more you work through the feelings, the more open you are to the higher dimensions. And then what finally happens is feelings become a very different proposition. When we're young and we're in dramas and all that, everything is intense and you feel a lot. And then as you start to get older, your sensibilities become a lot finer. And this is because the higher dimensions are coming right through.
And you mentioned that this is where we start moving beyond the notion of victimhood, of being victimized.
Yeah.
So that is a lower
can't
part
even
of that black and white
I
complex
can't even
as being the
imagine thinking
victim.
of myself as a victim.
Yet,
I can't imagine.
a huge percentage of people on the planet
I know,
still
of course,
do.
of course, yeah. And of course, it's not true. Nobody is a victim.
So let's talk about people that are watching this right now who maybe still experiencing feelings of victimhood and how you start discerning and working your way out of that. A little practical advice in working with the fourth realm now.
Yeah, I certainly would say step one is to realize you're not a victim. You know, the issue, you created it yourself. Wherever you are is something that you created. And if you are in a situation that's making you feel like you're a victim, then there's a high probability you need to get out of it or transform it. But you don't have to be a victim.
No, you don't.
No.
That's a matter of actually examining what these feelings are.
Yeah.
Taking them, accepting them,
Yeah.
and then examining them honestly.
Yeah, and so if you recall in the Pleiadian agenda, one of the things that the Pleiadians got into is to work with feelings by means of thinking.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
In other words, realize that feelings are real and that they mean something. And don't just keep feeling it, but start to really use your intelligence to really figure out what's causing this.
Right.
You know, because
Right.
some people just don't think that they can think about feelings.
Right.
You know, now you have to feel it. You can't not feel it by thinking. But then there's the issue of go ahead and feel it and go ahead and feel it hard. But what's really going on here?
Right.
You know?
So once we get to that point, we can start breaking beyond the victimization. I just bring that
Yeah.
up for anyone still struggling a little bit with that,
Oh,
feeling
yeah, there's a lot
wronged
of people who are struggling with
wronged
it.
by life
What-
still.
In fact, what I think is really incredible is I watch what's going on with the refugees, this especially Syrian refugees. They don't seem to feel that they're victims.
Mm-hmm.
They are just on the move, and they're going to go for it, and somehow they're going to have a better life.
Yeah.
And it's really amazing to see that, because when you think of what's been done to them, and yet they just figure, okay, I can't live here anymore. I'm going to find another life. And that's really
Yes.
an amazing thing to watch. It's too bad we don't have more information about that, because it's like a wave of people.
And speaking of waves of consciousness, you also write in your book about these ecstatic kinds of cultures start emerging when there's a real need for change. And as we talked about in our other interview, we're on the precipice of huge global change in
Yeah.
consciousness.
Yeah.
And we only have just a few minutes left. Let's talk about that part of it.
Well, you know, Regina, what I would say about that is I would say we really are starting to come up against the wall of organized religions, because organized religions are going to continue to keep people from changing. And yet
Yes.
the circumstances on the planet, regardless of what any religion thinks or believes, you can't avoid changing now. You can't avoid changing now. And so we're going to get blown through belief systems that, you know, we locked into and that we thought would take care of us. They're not going to take care of you.
No.
You know, if you're a Syrian mother who has 7 children, who's going to take care of you? The church isn't going to,
Right.
you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, going back to the Anunnaki for a moment, is it your understanding that the Anunnaki presence from the other dimension is what actually established the notion of religions on this planet for control?
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And I've gone through that in great detail.
Yes.
So what happened is it went into, you know, the Babylonian religion went into Hebrew religion, and then it went into Judeo-Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so what I'm really interested in my own work right now in fiction is that point 2,000 years ago,
Right.
when it transmuted into Judeo-Christianity.
Right, and we have to start breaking free of
Yeah.
that. We only have a couple of minutes left, and one of the things you also talk about is the fact that relationship and relationships are a way to start overcoming duality and really embracing this total polarity
Yeah.
to be experienced in this emotional realm.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why relationships are so powerful for us. Because the minute you're in a relationship, whatever polarity or duality that you haven't resolved yourself is going to start appearing in your partner and in the relationship itself. And it's almost like relationships are almost like a triangle.
Yes,
But they give you a new view that you can't have if you're just on your own.
that's very true.
So that's why we go into relationships periodically or
the
try
most
to stay in
challenging
them.
thing on this planet
Yes,
are
it is.
relationships with
It
each
is.
other.
Yeah, emotions are the most challenging, and then
Yes.
emotional relationships are the most challenging. Absolutely.
So we can use that as a blessing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
To start learning it through relationships and start observing our own emotions and reactions through this past trauma,
that's
be it
right.
collective or individual. We only have a couple minutes left. Again, any final thoughts on how we can thwart the manipulation from the 4D world that's been going on and elevate ourselves beyond that now?
Right. I really do think the trick for people now is to really start taking a look at organized religion. And what I mean by that is for Catholics to start considering what's going on with Islam, for Islamic people to consider what's going on with, and I'm using those 3 religions because those 3 religions are all coming down from Abraham, the
Yes.
Father God. And those 3 religions are creating the conflicts on the planet.
Yes.
And so for people who are
It's not the Buddhists.
no, they aren't. As I said to you, it'd be easier to be a Buddhist.
Exactly.
But it's really important for people of those 3 religions to start learning about and admiring the aspects of the other religion instead of demonizing them. Because if we demonize the other religion, it just turns into another duality, another us against them, and another war.
And it's just such a simple choice on one hand, yet it seems like it's lifetimes away.
I know it does seem like it, but I don't think so. because I think we're coming to that breaking point.
Good.
Yeah, I do.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I just want to thank you again for inviting us into your beautiful home and library here. Just one of the most spectacular metaphysical and scientific libraries I've ever seen, and also for allowing us to really go into more depth on the Anunnaki and your understanding of it. Because this is, I think, will be very refreshing and hopefully freeing for a lot of people.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly fear is not going to accomplish anything.
No slave species.
It's not.
We're no one's slave.
No, it's not. Well, thank you, Regina. Thanks
you,
for
Barbara.
coming.